The top 1% aren't smarter. They just remove the mental programming that keeps everyone else predictable. In a world built to distract you, manipulate you, and shape your thinking, mental independence is now a survival skill. Watch this to the end. Because in 30 days, you can rebuild the one thing the system can't control. A mind that thinks for itself. Good morning. And I need to warn you now that today's lecture is going to make some of you uncomfortable. It's not because I'm going to say anything shocking or offensive, but because I'm going to remove something that most people depend on without even realizing they depend on it. What I'm going to remove is the assumption that your thoughts are your own. And by the end of this, you're going to see the world completely differently. Most people believe they are free thinkers. They believe that because they can choose between options and express opinions and disagree with authority, that means they're mentally autonomous, that they're thinking for themselves. I'm here to tell you that belief is incorrect. Not mean this as an insult. I'm not saying you're stupid or weak-minded. I'm saying that what you experience as free thought is actually something else entirely. What you experience as free thought is better described as bounded cognition. And what does that mean? It means you operate within a carefully constructed range of acceptable interpretations and emotional reactions and moral conclusions. You think you're thinking freely, but actually you're thinking within a box. And the box is invisible to you because you've been inside it your whole life. And everyone around you is inside the same box. So it feels like reality itself because this is not a conspiracy. There's no secret group of people in a room deciding what you're allowed to think because conspiracies are actually comforting. Conspiracies are comforting because if there's a villain, you can fight the villain. But what I'm describing is much more fundamental than that. It's a requirement of civilization itself. Large, complex societies cannot function if every individual interprets reality independently. Think about this for a moment. If everyone had completely unique interpretations of right and wrong and truth and justice, society would collapse into chaos. So what civilization does, which is really clever, is it creates predictability, and predictability, not obedience, is the primary objective of power. So understand the difference here because it's crucial. Obedience is crude. Obedience means I tell you what to do and you do it because you're afraid of punishment. But that's expensive and unstable and it creates resistance. Predictability is elegant. Predictability means I can reliably forecast how you will react to information. If I can forecast your reactions, I don't need to coerce you. I can simply guide you. So let's talk about how this system developed over human history. It's a fascinating story. It reveals something profound about how power actually works. Historically, power began with violence. If you disobeyed the king or the chief or whoever was in charge, you were punished physically. That method worked for a while, but it was expensive and unstable. Violence creates resistance. When you beat people or kill people to make them obey, you're creating martyrs and you're creating resentment and eventually you're creating revolts. And any power system that depends on constant violence is exhausting. You need armies and prisons and executioners. So constantly be watching for rebellion is just not sustainable long term. Over time, successful societies discovered something far more efficient than violence. That discovery changed everything. That discovery was belief systems. Once power learned to install beliefs, that people defended themselves. Control became self-sustaining, which is the genius of it. You don't need guards if people are guarding themselves. Religion was one of the earliest large-scale psychological infrastructures. When I say infrastructure, I mean it worked like roads or bridges, except it was built inside people's minds. What religion did, which is really clever, is it compressed more complexity into simple binaries: good and evil, obedience and sin, loyalty and betrayal, and most importantly, religion internalized surveillance. You no longer needed physical guards watching everyone if people believed they were always being watched by God. So now you have people monitoring their own thoughts and policing their own behavior and reporting their own sins, which is infinitely more efficient than having an actual surveillance system. And people didn't resent it. They were grateful for it because they believed it was saving their souls and protecting them from evil. This is when power became truly sophisticated. When people started defending the system that controlled them because it confused the system for their own values. Now let's talk about education. Because education took this system and refined it to an incredible degree. Knowing some of you think education is about learning and freedom. But let me challenge that assumption. Education later refined the mechanism that religion created. And contrary to popular belief, education was never primarily about exploration. That's the myth we tell ourselves. Education was about standardization. And what does that mean? It means education taught citizens how to interpret authority and how to categorize knowledge and which questions were meaningful and which questions were dangerous. Think about your own education for a moment. You spent 12 years, maybe 16 years, maybe more in education institutions. And what did it teach you? They taught you facts, dates, and formulas, and vocabulary. But more importantly, they taught you how to think about facts and which facts mattered and which questions you are allowed to ask. Curiosity was permitted only within predefined boundaries. So you could ask, how does photosynthesis work? But you couldn't ask, why do we spend 6 hours a day sitting in rows memorizing information? You could ask, what year did World War II start? But you couldn't ask who benefited from the war and who made money from the war and why do we keep having wars? Those questions were outside the boundary. If you ask them too persistently, you are labeled a problem student or a troublemaker or someone who just didn't understand how things work. And the genius of the education system is that it convinces people they're learning to think critically while actually teaching them to think within very specific parameters. By the modern era, the system was complete. Media standardized emotional reactions and bureaucracy standardized behavior, and credentials standardized legitimacy. Social pressure replaced physical punishment, which is key to understand. Today, dissent does not require prisons. You don't need to lock people up anymore. What you need is reputational damage and economic precarity and social isolation. And those are much more effective than prisons because people fear them more than they fear jail. If I can destroy your career and make you a social outcast and make sure nobody will hire you or associate with you, I neutralize you more effectively than if I throw you in prison. Now at this point, it's important to clarify something because some of you are getting anxious and thinking, so we're all being controlled. What do we do? How do we fight back? Because programming is not inherently evil. It's necessary, and every society programs its members, and this has been true throughout all of human history. The danger arises when individuals confuse the program for reality itself. That's a key distinction I want you to understand. Because there's a difference between being programmed and being aware that you're programmed. Let me give you an example. We all agree that murder is wrong. And that agreement is programming. Because in a state of nature, there's no inherent reason why killing someone is wrong. But we're programmed to believe it's wrong. That programming is good. It allows us to live together peacefully and build civilizations and raise children without constant fear. So the programming itself isn't the problem. The problem is when you can't see the programming, when you believe that your moral reactions and emotional responses and intellectual conclusions are purely your own. To understand how programming is maintained, we must examine the mechanisms of the mind. And there are three primary mechanisms. We're going to go through each one carefully. The first mechanism is language, which is probably the most powerful mechanism. Because language doesn't merely describe reality. It defines what can be thought. If a concept cannot be named, it cannot be debated. And if a question cannot be phrased, it cannot be asked. Which is why taboo language exists. Most people think taboo language is about politeness. Like we don't say certain words because they're rude or offensive. But that's not really what's happening. What's happening is cognitive containment. Certain concepts are made unthinkable by making them unspeakable. And let me give you a concrete example. In many societies, there are topics that cannot be discussed in polite company. If you try to discuss them, you are immediately labeled as crazy or evil or dangerous. And the genius of this system is that people enforce it themselves. You don't need censorship boards when people censor themselves and each other. Now, think about your own life for a moment. Are there ideas that you've never fully articulated even to yourself because you know they're not allowed? All the questions that pop into your mind that you immediately suppress because asking them would make you a bad person or a conspiracy theorist or someone who doesn't understand that suppression, that's a system working. It's working inside your own mind and you're doing it to yourself, which is what I mean by internalized control. Language also shapes perception through framing. The same event can be described in completely different ways, depending on which words you use. Is someone a freedom fighter or a terrorist? Is something reform or destruction? Is someone undocumented or illegal? And each framing creates a different emotional reaction and a different moral conclusion. And once a frame is established, it's difficult to see outside of it, because the language itself channels your thinking into predetermined pathways. The second mechanism is emotion, because emotion is much faster than reason and much more powerful. Fear, outrage, guilt, and belonging bypass analysis. When emotion is activated, critical reasoning shuts down, which is not a metaphor. This is literal brain function. When your amygdala lights up, your prefrontal cortex goes quiet, and your prefrontal cortex is where reasoning happens. So emotionally charged information literally makes you dumber temporarily. Media does not primarily inform you. That's not its main function. Its main function is to calibrate your emotional responses. Over time, your nervous system becomes trained to react before you think. And let me give you an example of how this works in practice. You're scrolling through news or social media and you see a headline, and before you even read the full story, your body's already reacting. Your heart rate increases. Your jaw clenches. You feel anger or fear or disgust. And that reaction happens in milliseconds, way faster than conscious thought. Once that reaction is triggered, your conscious mind then works backwards to justify the emotion. So you think you're thinking rationally, but actually you're rationalizing an emotional reaction that was installed in you through repetition and conditioning. And you can't feel the difference from the inside. It feels like you're thinking clearly and arriving at logical conclusions when really you're just following an emotional script. Now, advertisers have known this for a century. Advertising is all about emotional conditioning. But what people don't realize is that news and education work the same way. You're being trained to have certain emotional reactions to certain stimuli. Over time, those reactions become automatic and you think they're your authentic feelings when really they're conditioned responses. The third mechanism is identity, which is the strongest lock of all the mechanisms. Because identity is how you understand yourself. Identity is the strongest lock. When beliefs become fused with self-image, challenges to those beliefs feel like existential threats. So let me explain what I mean by this. You have certain beliefs about politics or morality or how the world works. And those beliefs aren't just abstract ideas. Those beliefs are part of your identity. They're part of who you think you are. You're a good person who believes in X, or you're an intelligent person who understands Y. And this is why people defend ideas that harm them. Because to abandon the belief will require dismantling the self. Imagine you've spent 20 years believing that your political party represents justice and morality and the good guys. Now, someone presents you with evidence that your party has done something terrible, something that contradicts your core values, and the evidence is overwhelming. How do you react? Well, if you accept the evidence, you must accept that you've been wrong for 20 years and that you've been supporting something bad. But that's not just an intellectual adjustment. That's an identity crisis. Because you're not just someone who had wrong beliefs. You're someone who failed at moral reasoning. So what most people do is they reject the evidence. They come up with reasons why it's fake or biased or taken out of context because protecting the identity is more important than truth. And this happens across all domains. Religious identity, professional identity, national identity, ideological identity, and the stronger the identity, the harder it is to question. This is why converts are often the most extreme believers, because they rebuilt their entire sense of self around a new identity, and questioning it threatens their psychological stability. Now let's talk about how all these mechanisms are enforced. Because we've talked about language and emotion and identity, but there's one more layer that makes the system complete. Social enforcement completes the loop. And here's what's important to understand. Most control today is horizontal, not vertical. What do I mean by that? Well, vertical control is when the king tells the peasant what to do. It's top-down authority. But horizontal control is when the peasants police each other. You are monitored and corrected by peers, not rulers. Your co-workers and friends and family members are the ones enforcing conformity. Ostracism is the ultimate deterrent, and humans will tolerate almost anything to avoid social exile because we're social creatures. And being expelled from the group feels like death. In our evolutionary past, being expelled from your tribe meant actual death. You couldn't survive alone. So we have this deep psychological terror of being rejected by the group. And the system exploits that terror by making certain beliefs and questions and ideas marks of group membership. So if you express the wrong opinion, you're not just wrong, you're other. You're not one of us anymore. That triggers this primal fear of abandonment and is self-enforcing. Nobody has to tell people to please each other. They do it automatically because they're afraid of being cast out themselves. This is why social media has been so effective at control. It creates instant visibility of who's in the group and who's outside the group. One wrong statement. You can be publicly shamed and expelled from multiple communities simultaneously and have your reputation destroyed. That possibility keeps everyone in line. So at this stage, many of you are asking the obvious question. And the question is unprogramming possible? And can I actually escape these mechanisms, or am I just trapped forever? I'm going to give you the honest answer. And the honest answer is not for most people, but it's the truth. Awareness carries psychological cost, and stability is more comfortable than clarity. And belonging is more rewarding than truth. Historically, only a small minority choose to see clearly, and even fewer remain functional afterward. And let me explain what that means. When you start to see the programming, you lose the comfort that the programming provided. Suddenly, moral certainty becomes difficult. Social belonging becomes conditional. You start to notice how narratives move people, and how emotions are manipulated, and how language shapes perception. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And that awareness is isolating because most people around you are still operating within the program. They don't want to hear what you've discovered. In fact, they'll often become hostile when you try to share it because you're threatening their psychological stability and their sense of identity. So yes, unprogramming is possible, but it comes at a price. And the price is you may lose friends, you may lose comfort, you may lose your sense of belonging. And you must ask yourself, is that price worth it? And for most people, the answer is no. That's fine. There's no more judgment here. Living with programming is easier than living with awareness. And most people, when given the choice, will choose the easier path. But for those of you who are still interested, who want to know how this works and how to resist it, let me introduce you to what I call the elite method. Now, before I go further, I need to clarify what I mean by the word elite. When people hear that word, they often think I'm talking about conspiracy theories or secret societies. When I use the word elite, I am not referring to secret groups or conspiracies. I'm referring to institutions that persist across generations. The elite are defined by continuity, not morality. And what do I mean by that? Well, elite institutions are families or organizations or networks that maintain power and influence over long periods of time. These might be old money families or prestigious universities or certain professional networks. And what distinguishes them is not that they're evil, but that they understand systems differently than most people. Elite education differs fundamentally from mass education, which is key to understand because most people have no idea what elite education actually looks like. Mass education, which is what most of us receive, emphasizes belief. It teaches you what to believe about history, morality, and how society works. But elite education emphasizes structure over belief and models over morals and history without heroism. Structure over belief means you don't learn that capitalism is good or bad. You learn how capitalist systems function. You learn the mechanics, not the morality. Models over morals means you don't learn that democracy is the best system. You learn how different governance systems operate and under what conditions each one succeeds or fails. History without heroism means you don't learn about great men and villains. You learn about incentive structures and institutional evolution and long-term patterns. And emotional detachment is trained deliberately. Elite education actively discourages moral urgency because moral urgency interferes with long-term strategy. If you're outraged about injustice, you're thinking emotionally, and emotional thinking leads to poor decisions. So elite institutions train people to observe dispassionately. Now, here's something that's going to sound counterintuitive, but it's crucial to understand. is that elites do not believe more strongly. They believe less. Let me say that again. It's important. Elites believe less than regular people, which is the opposite of what most people think. Most people think powerful people must have strong beliefs and strong convictions. That's how they got power. But actually, the opposite is true. What elite education teaches is that belief systems are tools. Law, ideology, and religion are instruments, not identities. This flexibility makes them difficult to manipulate. If you don't have strong beliefs, then I can't use your beliefs to control you. Let me give you an example. Imagine someone who deeply believes in democracy and freedom, and those beliefs are core to their identity. I want to manipulate that person. I present a situation where democracy is threatened, and immediately that person will react predictably. They'll support whatever I'm proposing if I frame it as defending democracy. I've used their beliefs to guide their behavior without them realizing it. But now imagine someone who doesn't really believe in democracy. They just understand democracy as one possible system among many with certain advantages and disadvantages. That person is much harder to manipulate because I can't trigger their beliefs to create predictable behavior. They're going to ask questions and analyze incentives and think strategically. So the paradox is that the people with the strongest beliefs are the easiest to control, and the people with the weakest beliefs are the hardest to control. And this is why elite education systematically weakens belief and replaces it with analytical frameworks. Because analytical thinking is more useful than moral conviction. Now let me tell you about one of the most important traits of elite thinking. It's something that most people completely miss. That's silence. One of the most important traits is silence and power speaks less. This is a rule that elite institutions teach and regular people violate constantly. Expression creates commitment, and commitment creates vulnerability. And why this matters? When you express a strong opinion publicly, you've committed yourself to a position. And now you must defend that position even if new information suggests you were wrong. Your ego becomes invested in being right. And your identity becomes tied to that opinion, making you predictable and therefore controllable. But if you stay silent and observe and listen, you maintain freedom of movement. You can change your position without losing face. Strategic ambiguity preserves freedom of movement, which is why elite communications are often vague or non-committal or carefully hedged. They're not being dishonest, they're being strategic because ambiguity is power and certainty is weakness. Compare this to how regular people communicate. Regular people feel compelled to express opinions on everything and to signal their values constantly. They post on social media about every issue. They argue with strangers. They make sure everyone knows exactly where they stand. And this feels good. It feels like you're being authentic and engaged and taking a stand. But strategically, it's a disaster because you've given away all your leverage. Now, everyone knows how to manipulate you because they know exactly what you believe and what you care about and what will trigger an emotional reaction. Silence is not the absence of thought. Silence is strategic positioning, and elite institutions understand this in a way that mass culture does not. So now we must address the central claim of this lecture. That's the idea that you can unprogram your brain in 30 days. This phrase is misleading, and there's no neutral mind. You cannot remove all programming. What you can do is become aware of programming. That awareness changes how you process information, but it doesn't free you from systems entirely. The realistic goal is not unprogramming, but becoming unprogrammable. And what does that mean? It means resisting automatic installation of new narratives. Think of it like this. Now, your mind is like a computer that automatically installs any software that gets presented to it. Someone shows you a narrative, and you just believe it. But what if you could change that setting so that narratives require your explicit permission before installing? And that's what we're trying to achieve here. So the 30-day framework is not a transformation. It's not going to turn you into some enlightened being. It's an interruption. And what I mean is, it interrupts the automatic processes that normally govern your thinking and forces you to observe them. And once you observe them, you can never fully forget that observation. You might fall back into old patterns, but you'll know you're doing it. So, let me walk you through the 30-day framework. And there are 4 phases. And each phase has specific tasks and specific challenges. And I'm going to be very explicit about what to expect. In the first phase, days 1 through 7, the task is simple and difficult. That task is suspend moral reflexes. Do not immediately judge information as good or evil. But it's actually hard because moral judgment is automatic. Someone tells you about an event, and before they even finish a sentence, your brain has already decided if it's good or bad, right or wrong, just or unjust. That reflex is the first thing you must interrupt. And here's how you do it. When you feel that moral judgment arising, just pause. Don't suppress it. Don't pretend you don't feel it. Just notice it and then delay your conclusion and sit with the discomfort of not knowing if something is good or bad. This is going to feel awful. Discomfort is expected because moral certainty is one of the main ways we manage anxiety. When we can label something as evil, we feel like we understand it. We know what side we're on. We're one of the good people fighting the bad people. But when you suspend that judgment, you're left with ambiguity. And ambiguity creates anxiety. And your mind is going to desperately want to resolve that anxiety by judging. Don't let it. Just observe your emotional reactions and notice how strong they are and how quickly they arise and how they try to force a conclusion. This practice alone will teach you more about your programming than a year of reading will. Because you'll see the mechanisms operating in real time. You see a news story about a political figure doing something controversial, and immediately you feel anger or approval. Just stop and ask yourself, where did that reaction come from? And why was it so fast? And what if I'm wrong about this? And what would change if I were wrong? You don't have to arrive at a different conclusion. The point is not to reverse your beliefs. The point is to see how beliefs form and how emotions drive them. Now let me tell you why this first phase feels so uncomfortable. Because a lot of people quit during week 1. They quit because the discomfort is too intense. What you're experiencing during this phase is the psychological structure that normally protects you being temporarily disabled. Moral judgment serves a function. It gives you certainty, and certainty gives you confidence. And confidence allows you to function in the world without constant doubt. When you suspend moral judgment, you're removing that psychological armor, and suddenly the world feels dangerous and chaotic and incomprehensible. This is normal. This is the experience of seeing clearly without the filter of pre-programmed interpretations. Most people cannot tolerate this state for long. It feels like losing your mind or losing your values or becoming a bad person. You might worry that if you don't immediately condemn evil, then you're complicit in evil, or that questioning your beliefs means abandoning your principles. But actually, the opposite is true. Suspending judgment doesn't mean abandoning values. It means examining values to see if they're really yours. The other thing that happens during week 1 is social friction. You're going to be in conversations where everyone is expressing strong opinions and you're going to stay quiet. And people are going to notice. They're going to push you to take a side. And you're going to feel enormous pressure to signal your allegiance. This is the horizontal enforcement we talked about earlier. And your job is to resist it not by arguing, but by simply not participating in a moral performance. You can say, I don't know enough about this. Or, I'm still thinking about it. Or, I'm not sure. And people will think, that's weird. But that's fine. The point of week 1 is to create space between stimulus and response. That space is where thinking actually happens. In days 8 to 14, you move to the second phase. And this phase is about replacing opinions with models. Stop asking who is right and start asking how systems function, which is a fundamental shift in how you process information. Most people, when they encounter a problem or an event, immediately ask, who's to blame? Who's the villain? And who's the victim? And who's on the side? But that question, while it feels satisfying, doesn't actually help you understand what's happening. Because most complex events don't have simple villains. Instead, start asking, how do the incentive structures work here? And what are the institutional constraints? And what are the long-term patterns? Let me give you an example. There's a crisis in healthcare, and costs are rising. People are suffering, and the typical response is to blame someone. Maybe you blame insurance companies, or maybe you blame government regulation, or maybe you blame doctors or pharmaceutical companies, depending on your programming. But that blame-based thinking doesn't help you understand the system. It just makes you feel morally righteous. Instead, ask, how does healthcare financing work? And what are the incentives for each actor? And what constraints do they face? How has the system evolved over time? When you ask those questions, you start to see structure instead of heroes and villains. And structure is much more useful than morality for understanding reality. Identify incentives and trace cause and effect and remove villains from your explanations, which is hard because villain-based narratives are emotionally satisfying. But they're also intellectually lazy. They let you stop thinking as soon as you've identified the bad guy. Structural analysis requires you to keep thinking and to follow chains of causation and to understand that most outcomes are the result of systemic forces, not individual choices. So a practical method for removing villains from your thinking. This is one of the hardest parts of the process. Every time you find yourself blaming a person or a group, stop and ask what incentives are shaping their behavior. Humans generally act in predictable ways given their constraints and incentives. So if someone is doing something harmful, ask what would make that behavior rational from their perspective. This doesn't mean justifying harm. It means understanding the logic of the system that produces harm. Let me give you a controversial example. Let's say a pharmaceutical company prices a drug so high that people can't afford it. People die. The typical response is, this company is evil. They're killing people for profit. We need to destroy them. That's the villain narrative. But if you remove the villain and look at structure, you ask different questions. What are the incentives facing pharmaceutical companies in the current regulatory environment? How does patent law work? How do insurance negotiations work? How does drug development financing work? And what would happen if this company priced differently? And when you follow those questions, you realize the problem isn't individual evil, it's systemic design. And the solution isn't punishing villains, it's changing structures. This type of thinking is emotionally unsatisfying. It doesn't give you anyone to hate, but it's intellectually honest and strategically useful. And here's a key insight. Once you start thinking structurally, you become difficult to manipulate because most propaganda relies on villain narratives. Politicians and media want you to be angry at specific groups because anger is energizing and it drives engagement. But anger directed at villains rarely solves problems. Anger directed at structures is more useful, but it's also harder to maintain because structures are abstract, and abstract enemies don't generate emotional satisfaction. Now we come to the most difficult phase, which is days 15 through 21. And the task is detaching identity from belief. This is the most destabilizing phase. Ideas must become provisional. You must be willing to discard positions without experiencing self-collapse. Most people fail here. This phase requires you to do something that feels psychologically impossible. You need to separate who you are from what you believe. That sounds simple, but it's not because your beliefs are woven into your self-concept. Let me explain what I mean. Now, if someone challenges your core beliefs, it feels like they're challenging you personally. If you believe in social justice, someone questions social justice frameworks, you feel attacked. You feel like they're calling you a bad person. But what if you could hold beliefs provisionally without fusing them to your identity? And what if you could change your mind without it threatening your sense of self? This requires a fundamental restructuring of how you understand yourself. It means defining yourself by something other than your beliefs. Some people define themselves by their methods instead of their conclusions. I'm someone who thinks carefully and updates based on evidence rather than I'm someone who believes X. Others define themselves by their relationships or their creativity or their capacity for growth, but not by any particular ideological position. The practice for this phase is to actively experiment with holding opposite positions. Take a belief you have and argue against it. Not in public where you face social consequences, but in private or with a trusted friend who understands what you're doing. And notice what happens in your body when you argue against your own position. Notice the anxiety and the discomfort and the sense that you're betraying something. That discomfort is the identity belief fusion. And the practice is to sit with that discomfort until it loosens. Let me tell you exactly why most people fail at this phase, because I've watched this happen many times. It follows a predictable pattern. What happens is people start to experiment with questioning the beliefs. They feel fine at first, it's just an intellectual exercise. But then they start to really consider the possibility that they might be wrong about something important, and panic sets in. Because if you're wrong about this important thing, what else are you wrong about if you don't know what's true anymore? Then who are you? The self starts to feel unstable. And instability is terrifying because we need a coherent sense of self to function in the world. So what most people do at this point is they snap back to their original positions with even more fervor than before. This is called belief crystallization. It happens when questioning goes too far and threatens psychological stability. So the mind overcorrects. suddenly all the doubts vanish and the original beliefs feel more certain than ever, and anyone who questions them seems like a threat or a fool. This is a defense mechanism. It's a psyche protecting itself from dissolution. It's completely understandable. The way to avoid this is to go slowly and to maintain some stable sense of self that isn't based on any particular belief. You need an anchor. Something that remains constant even as your beliefs shift. And for some people, that anchor is curiosity or honesty or compassion. For others, it's relationships or creative work or commitment to understanding. But whatever it is, you need something that isn't belief-based. And even with an anchor, this phase is difficult. Some people will decide it's not worth it. They'll choose psychological stability over clarity. There's no shame in that. This is a valid choice because clarity has real costs and not everyone wants to pay those costs. In days 22 through 30, you enter the final phase. And this phase is about strategic silence and practicing it in your actual life. Practice strategic silence. Speak less, signal less, observe more, and watch how narratives move people. Notice how power flows through institutions rather than individuals, which is where you start to apply everything you've learned. The practice is simple. You're going to deliberately reduce how much you express your opinions and how much you signal your values. This is going to feel unnatural because we're trained to constantly broadcast our positions, especially on social media. But strategic silence means you're going to observe without participating in the forms of belief. In conversations where people are expressing strong opinions, you just don't listen and watch and notice patterns. Notice how people use certain phrases that signal group membership. Notice how emotional reactions spread through a group. Notice how someone will say something and everyone immediately agrees, not because they thought about it, but because agreement signals loyalty. And notice how uncomfortable people get when you don't signal. When you just listen without agreeing or disagreeing, they'll often push you to take a side because your silence feels like a threat to the group consensus. The practice is to resist that pressure and to remain in observation mode and to get comfortable with other people being uncomfortable. This doesn't mean you never speak. You can speak when you have something genuinely useful to contribute that advances understanding. But you stop speaking just to signal where you stand or to perform your identity or to get social approval. Over time, you'll notice that your mind becomes quieter and clearer because you're not constantly generating opinions and defenses. And you'll notice that you see patterns you missed before. When you're not busy broadcasting, you can actually receive information. So let's talk about what you actually gain from completing this 30-day process. It's important to be realistic about what changes and what doesn't. At the end of this process, you will not be free. Let me be clear about that. You will still live inside systems. You'll still have bills to pay and jobs to maintain and social obligations to fulfill. And none of that goes away. But you will no longer confuse those systems for reality itself, which is a subtle but profound shift. You'll see the programming while you're being programmed. You'll notice when narratives are being installed and when emotions are being triggered. This awareness doesn't make you immune, but it does make you more resistant because you have that pause between stimulus and response. You'll also gain a kind of cognitive flexibility that most people don't have. You'll be able to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously. You won't be trapped in binary thinking where everything is good or evil, right or wrong, us or them. Instead, you'll be able to see how different people with different incentives and different information might reasonably come to different conclusions. This makes you more effective as a thinker and as a strategist because you're not constrained by ideological rigidity. You'll also gain the ability to navigate institutional environments more skillfully because you understand how power actually works. You won't waste energy fighting symbolic battles or expressing outrage or trying to change people's minds through argument. Instead, you'll focus on leverage points and structural changes and long-term positioning because those are what actually matter. And perhaps most importantly, you'll gain a certain kind of freedom from manipulation because you can see manipulation attempts as they happen. When someone tries to trigger your fear or outrage or tribal identity, you'll notice the attempt. You can choose whether to respond. Now let's talk about what you lose. This is just as important, and I need to be very explicit about the cost. You may lose comfort. More certainty is comfortable, and ambiguity is stressful. And you're trading comfort for clarity. You may lose belonging because communities are built around shared beliefs. If you hold beliefs provisionally, you're always someone outside. When you see structure instead of villains, it becomes harder to be outraged. And outrage is often what motivates people to do things. You may also lose the comfort of simple stories. Heroes and villains and good versus evil. Those narratives are psychologically satisfying even if they're not accurate. Your relationships may change too if your friends are bonded by shared ideological commitments and you step outside those commitments. The bonds weaken. Some people will feel betrayed by your refusal to signal your beliefs. They'll interpret your silence as disloyalty or cowardice. Now, let me be specific about how this feels in practice. Awareness does not make you happier. In fact, ignorance really is bliss. When you see the programming, you lose the capacity for simple enjoyment because you're always aware of the machinery underneath. You watch a movie, and instead of getting lost in the story, you notice the propaganda and the emotional manipulation. You read the news, and instead of feeling informed, you see the narrative construction and the selective emphasis. You talk to friends, and instead of connecting effortlessly, you notice the social signaling and the tribal performance. But you do it with a kind of double consciousness, where you're both in the experience and observing the experience simultaneously. And that double consciousness is exhausting. It requires constant cognitive effort. You can never fully relax.